Good morning. And if no one said it yet, I would like to say welcome to California. One of our staff members from New York, a senior staff member, Monday, looked at me and he went, "Pitt, it's beautiful outside. You know it's 42 degrees Fahrenheit in New York City today?" I was like, "Yeah, isn't it great out here? Welcome to California." It does rain in California. We have other things that we get to deal with in California, unscheduled, non-seasonal events. Well, some of them are seasonal. Fires, earthquakes, politics. But, you know, in that sense, we haven't seen much locust yet, or famine. That's a good thing. But we do understand that other parts of the world and other parts of the country have more seasonal kinds of activities. Tornadoes, hurricanes. Oh, there's a topic for you, hurricanes. So I understand there was this event a while back that was called Sandy. And we were actually in Cambridge, England, at an Uptime Institute network conference for our EMEA group. And we had people who couldn't get to the conference because of the consequence of the storm. And Andy Lawrence and some of his team jumped right on it, started calling people and getting extracted little sound bites of what's going on, how are people surviving. Following that, Vince Renault and his team did a more comprehensive dig into it. And what you're about to be presented is some really neat information about a really horrific experience. But we can all learn from other people's pain. Very much like the Raging Wire presentation last night. There it is, they experienced it. What can you learn from it? So here to present that information is Debbie Seidman, our senior technical consultant based in the Denver office, Denver area. And she and Vince Renault actually did the work to develop this knowledge and this information. And I'm delighted to have Debbie Seidman come on up and present this deck. Debbie? Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. As you know, we're here to talk about Superstorm Sandy. And this was a very significant storm. There was a lot of damage. This occurred in 2012. Millions lost power. There was a lot of severe damage, costs, repairs, etc. And while this really was unfortunate and a significant storm, this also provided an opportunity for us to learn more about what can happen if your company is in a similar situation. So the Uptime Institute took advantage of this opportunity. We put a survey together. What I'd like to do today is talk about the survey, what we learned, what worked well, what needed improvement. First off, I will discuss the survey methodology. We gathered information on the impacts to the digital infrastructure. Bottom line is your IT. You want your computers up and running. Were you successful with that, or did the storm just cause too many problems? Were you prepared? We had 131 respondents. The format of the questions were yes or no questions, as well as we had many questions that required a written response. Now, all of the questions, of which there were many, fell into 4 categories. The first was the impact. What kind of impact did you see at your facility, on your organization, again, ultimately on your compute environment? What preparations did you make prior to the storm? Did you have disaster recovery or business continuity plans in place? What did those entail, and how effective were those? And then we have many, many lessons learned. So let's start off with impacts. What were the impacts of the storm? Of course, there was a lot of flooding. There were many major issues, but ultimately, as I've mentioned, what was the impact to your site and the IT equipment on your site? This is a photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I would like to thank the respondents of the survey, also those that helped us by submitting some photographs. So what were the impacts to organizational computing? The survey asked respondents to respond to the comment of describe the nature of how your organization's computing needs were impacted. Now, the majority of responses centered around power, whether that be utility power, engine generator power, fuel or lack thereof, and then fuel issues that would affect your engine generator runtimes. Also, we had comments on flooding, utility losses. Many sites said we had 2 utility sources, yet we still saw problems. I would like to emphasize the Uptime Institute recognizes that a lot of companies use utility power. Of course, that's done. It's economically the way to run your site, but we do not consider that a power source that you have control over. If you have a tier certified facility, we require that you have engine generator power or some type of your own generation on site. Ultimately, that is what you have control over. You do not have control over a utility, and if the utility goes down or if there are losses to utility. So that is something to consider. The sites that proactively switched to engine generators had the most successes, and while there were a lot of successes, some sites did have to shut down. So this was a general overview. Let's now lead into stored preparations, or preparations that were made prior to the storm. So you'll see here the survey said, describe any preparations you made prior to the storm. And there are many, many items listed here. They're varied. There are quite a few different ones. I'm going to highlight just a few. First off, make sure that you have maintenance actions and that your maintenance actions are up to date. A lot of sites found that they had some type of pre-planning document, but perhaps their documents were out of date. Roles and responsibilities change, contact information changes, equipment changes. So check to see that you have those actions. Make sure that they're up to date. Now, this is a critical time coming up. You have an opportunity. While you do not want it to happen, it was known that the storm was going to hit before it hit. So make sure that you have a plan and that it's up to date. Review your operational procedures. Also, run through those. This is an emergency situation coming up. Your staff, while they are likely highly qualified, they're going to be stressed. They're going to be in a time crunch. It's an emergency situation. So make sure that they have all the tools they can. If they have not prepared and they don't have good standard operating procedures to work from, for example, they may just be rushing and they might reach for the wrong circuit breaker, for example, possibly the wrong valve. So there were also some impacts. While this was asking for describing the preparations you made, we did receive some related items for impacts as a result of preparation or improperly preparing. Now, most all sites anticipated that they would be able to utilize staff from other locations, either nearby locations or even from other states. But what was not anticipated was the impact to transportation. So roadways were closed, airports were closed. Even when roadways were possibly open, there were shortages of gasoline. So while provisions were made for staff to come when needed onto the site from remote locations, that was unsuccessful, and a lot of those actions were delayed. Another impact, regardless of the preparation, and this was interesting to note, were impacts at other locations. So we received at least 2 respondents that had sites in the Midwest. They had impacts at their sites in the Midwest. Now, these weren't in the storm area. They weren't hit by the storm. However, they had construction projects, and those construction schedules were delayed. So in effect, what happened is after Superstorm Sandy hit the Northeast U.S., there were impacts in those locations, and those sites became priorities for delivery of materials and equipment. As such, other construction sites, such as data center construction sites in other parts of the country, had their schedules impacted because then they incurred delays due to receiving materials. It caused problems. It's a cascading effect. Now, these were many precautions taken. Let's talk about how the owners reflected on how well these precautions actually worked. So the survey asked, how effective were these preparations? And I cannot emphasize enough, as could the respondents, you need to prepare, you need to have a plan. You need to think about it, and you need to get into the details. Think about what is going to happen, what is the next step. These are data centers. These are high reliability facilities. Pre-planning is a must. It's a minimum that you have to do. All of the respondents said that. You'll see the two comments at the bottom. How well did your preparations work? Respondents said extremely effective, very effective. Those are not my words. Those are the words of people that had responded. So, again, it was definitely worthwhile to prepare. We'll get into more details on this shortly. Survey asked some questions related to disaster recovery plans, DR plans. Did you have a disaster recovery or business continuity plan in place? Almost all of the respondents, yes, did have this in place, as would be expected for a critical facility such as a data center. Now, the question was also asked, did you use your data center recovery plan or business continuity plan, and was it successful? Roughly half were impacted enough that they needed to use a plan, and a little more than half actually, roughly half did not need to use a plan, and more than half did need to use a plan. So those that did, these are a lot of the highlights of the impacts, or of the steps that they needed to take. Some sites that were successful shifted their mission critical load to a remote location. That tended to work very well if you were positioned to do that. There was discussion about assistance from other sites, so that would either be assistance from an IT team elsewhere or a facilities team elsewhere. And again, as mentioned, there were a lot of unanticipated effects. This was due to closure of roadways. The closure of roadways impacted how much fuel you could receive. It impacted, as I mentioned, staffing being able to come on site. It impacted vendors. There were many owners and sites that were on, quote, priority lists for vendors, and they had prepared well for vendors to come on site and help out. However, once again, vendors were not able to travel to the site. There was a lot of flooding. That severity, there was a lot of flooding. There was a lot of water infiltration through the building shell. It was known that there might be some flooding. A lot of sites prepared with sandbagging, et cetera. But the impacts, the amount of flooding really was more than was anticipated. So while these items worked, as you see, it says it works, we used it and we were successful. Many sites were good, there still were impacts. I'd like to talk about lessons learned. We had many, many lessons learned. In general, we asked questions about what worked well, what didn't work so well, what required improvement. And all the lessons learned, the most frequent responses for what worked well, the biggest one was successes from pre-planning. And I've already talked about that quite a bit. It's imperative that you do some pre-planning. You have plans and you test your plans. Now, the biggest minus, the most frequent comment for what needed to be improved was a desire to improve fuel supply, and I'll have more details about that coming up shortly. So what worked well? As I mentioned, the planning worked well, but where are some other things? The survey asked, what is the one thing you would do the same? So one comment was staffing. There was the response of, thank your staff. I think this is done, but at a minimum, you need to have well-qualified staff, experienced staff. So thank your staff. Also, make sure you include your staff in your planning. They know the site, they know the equipment. So make sure that they're included. Now, when you have disaster recovery plans, is make sure, again, with your disaster recovery plans, you've got a lot of action steps. Make sure all the way down to standard operating procedures on your equipment, your engine generators, your electrical switchgear, and drill and practice. Make sure that you're well prepared ahead of time. A quote from one of the respondents, execute in a controlled and disciplined manner. That is really what you're striving for. And again, those that spent the time up front would definitely spend the time up front again. It's a little more detail about what worked well. As I mentioned, staff, involve your staff in planning. This is not just a boardroom activity. They are really the ones that know the site. So they know what works and what doesn't. Also regarding staff, once an event like this hits, your staff will be working round the clock. And this event lasted many days longer than was originally anticipated. So after 2 or 3 days, with your staff working round the clock, your technical staff, they're fairly spent. At some point, they are not effective. It can become very dangerous. So again, as was anticipated, you should need to have backup site from elsewhere. Now, there were some owners that said they would bring staff on site sooner next time to alleviate some of these impacts. Logistics. There was thoughts to bring staff on site from other locations. It was not anticipated that the roadways would close. Also, many sites had talked about, they had cots, they had food on their site, knowing that their staff would stay on site for long durations. There were also many sites that had hotels for their staffing. What they had not anticipated was that either the hotels would close, or again, the roadways would be closed and the staff would not be able to get from the hotels to the site, to the job site. IT, as we mentioned, some sites move their critical work to other locations. Also consider doing some load shedding of your IT, have a load shedding plan in place. And this can be difficult, having been in situations, at least for temporary shutdowns for major construction work. What happens when you have a large corporation is the different divisions, the different departments, tend to all really focus on their own group, and they think their compute equipment is the most important. So all of the different departments really need to put on their company hat, so to speak, and look at the big picture and understand that they need to step in and determine what can be shut off temporarily to save the site as a whole. Facility issues. I'd like to comment that I did not receive any comments to the survey, any responses to the survey related to cooling. So I do not know if there were impacts to cooling, but none were mentioned. Really, all of it was focused on power. Power and flooding. One interesting item to note with facility issues, there was a site that said that their engine generators overheated. They said the wind pressure was so strong and the wind direction was different than typical, and therefore the hot exhaust could not exhaust, the hot air did not exhaust properly from their engine generator system. Their engine generators overheated and went down. So how do you anticipate and plan for that? That's a difficult one, but it's a good lessons learned. Internal communications, couple things to think about. There were some successes with that. There were sites that had bridge lines. They had numbers that occupants could call in and get updates. There was also a site that had an interesting, almost antidote, and they said that the IT group, this came from a facilities group, the IT group was very concerned that facilities would be able to successfully keep the site up and running, but due to the strong communication during the event, at the beginning of the event, and throughout the duration of the event, all that did was increase the confidence of the IT group that the facilities group knew what they were doing, understood the site topology, and they were successful keeping things up and running. So that was a plus that came out of that situation. So again, this is a high reliability facility. Yeah, think about what can you expect, what did you know, when was it known, and what can you do about it? Anticipate as much as you can. Invest a lot of time in planning. So these are items that worked well. Let's talk about items that needed improvement. So the survey asked, what is the one thing you would do differently? You can see here there's a list of several things. There were comments in response to flooding. So a lot of comments about moving equipment to higher elevations. Now this included, there were issues with flooding at fuel oil tanks that occurred quite frequently. But in addition to fuel oil tanks, consider sites that had fuel oil pumps below grade, fuel oil piping below grade, controls below grade. Any of those that you can move up to a higher elevation is something definitely worth considering. There were many comments about improving the engine generator topology. So by that I mean making sure you have redundant engine generators. Again, This relates to tiers, but do you want redundant engine generators, redundant paths? How far do you need to take that? That depends on your business model. Also take into account the location. Again, a place like New York City, a hurricane-prone location, you might want to put in more robustness than you might in another location. I would like to comment related to this. The Uptime Institute has a network. It's a consortium of owners. They share best practices. They also share problems that they've had so that they can learn from each other. And with this network, there is something called the AIRS. That is the Abnormal Incident Report Database, and all the network members contribute to that. That network has shown, or that database has shown, that one of the biggest saves that you can do is to have redundant equipment, and in particular, redundant engine generators. Another item that needed improvement was testing of switchover, and by that I mean switchover from utility power to engine generator power. Many sites, many organizations, of course, practice this up front. It should be part of your normal operations and regular maintenance plans. There were a few sites, not many, but there were a few that said that they would possibly move their data center to another location. And we did receive many comments, certainly more than one comment, that said that their planning was so effective they would not do anything differently. So what needed improvement? Fuel. Fuel was a large issue, was a big problem. There were many things that sites did. They either talked about that they had implemented, planned to implement, or would implement in the future. So one included having an additional supplier for fuel. So at least 2 different suppliers for fuel. This was creative. There was a site that thought that it would be a good idea to bring a fuel truck on site and park it on their site for the duration of the event in a future event. I don't know the feasibility of that, but I thought it was a nice idea. There was a site that was successful because they ended up bringing fuel from another state. Of course, many sites talked about being on a priority list for fuel. While that's a good intent, there's a lot of problems with that. You may be on a priority list, but really the biggest priority are going to be life safety facilities. So fire, paramedics, police, hospitals, medical, they will really be #1 on the list. And then even if you are high on the list, again, in this situation, roadways were closed. So there were transportation issues, roadways were closed. There were refineries that were shut down, so fuel may have not been available. The suppliers themselves, the vendors that provide the fuel, they had their own issues. So for example, a lot of them had phone systems go down. Now, some of these vendors had more success because they had their own engine generators. There was a site that had problems with dispensing fuel due to lack of power. This was also very creative. This vendor actually implemented a gravity system for dispensing fuel. So interesting to see what can occur. There were a couple sites that talked about they had problems with sediment in their fuel, and this was not known. They did not know whether this was from their own tanks, storage on site, or if this was from the trucks that delivered the fuel. But again, fuel polishing is a minimum best practice, something that you might want to do at your site. Now, this event lasted 8 hours, between 8 hours. People ran on their engine generators from between 8 hours and 8 days. Some couldn't run as long as they wanted to because of lack of fuel, and you'll see here at the bottom of the slide, the Uptime Institute tier standard requires a 12-hour on-site storage at a minimum, and I'd like to stress that is a minimum. And without going into too many details, this would be concurrently maintainable storage to support concurrently maintainable engine generators if in fact you were a tier 3 or tier 4 site. But what I'd like to stress is this 12 hours is a minimum. If you are in a location that is prone to a disaster, whether that be a man-made disaster or a natural disaster, consider if 12 hours is the right number for you. You may likely want much more than 12 hours of on-site, again, on-site fuel. So what needed improvement in terms of infrastructure? I already alluded to this, but there are sites that are now considering plant additions. So this may be adding engine generators. Also want to comment on if you are trying to do work, it's the nature of being in New York City, construction can be more difficult. It's more expensive. I'm in Colorado. We have the advantage of it's fairly easy to get staging areas. A lot of the costs are lower. So New York City can be a more difficult place to do construction, a more expensive place. However, understood, if that's where your business needs to be, that's where your clients are, that's where your ownership is, that might be the trade-off you need to make. Now, for plant additions, in terms of power, this was increasing resiliency, redundancy. Also, as I had mentioned earlier, moving some of your critical equipment to a higher elevation, higher ground. Another thing to think about, and this would be for power, your power distribution, your fuel oil lines, maybe some makeup water lines or domestic water if you're using some of that for a cooling source, such as cooling towers. If you have redundant sources or two sources, think about physically separating those. That way, if you have physical impact in one location, you are less likely to lose both sources if they're far apart. And this even affects day-to-day. For example, we call it the backhoe test. If you have a backhoe, it takes out one pipe, one piece of conduit, a trench. It's nice to have something at another location so that backhoe doesn't take out both sources. There were comments about wind speeds, that the wind speeds were really high enough that the usual protection at your building shell didn't work. A lot of lobbies flooded, as I'm sure you know. Communication backbone, we only had one comment of the actual backbone or the fiber voice data lines coming into the site being down. So that didn't appear to be a large of issue as you might anticipate. However, there were a lot of phone systems that went down, and this is because the voice system terminal devices did not have UPS power, they were not on engine generator power, and they had limited localized battery. So a recommendation, something to consider, is placing your phone system on engine generator and UPS power. It should be a small load that really might not be a high cost item. I like this picture. I think some of you may have seen something like this. This is Hoboken subway. You see the turnstiles, water coming in through the elevator. So I have a comment here on water. It's not related to flooding, but this quote was, "Water can get in the building when wind blows it uphill. Be ready for it." So other items needing improvement. Load transfer. Now, what's the definition? What do I mean by load transfer? Of course, I mean transferring from utility to engine generator, but more specifically, I mean the engine generator starting, ramping up to load, and also all of the controls working properly. So, of course, don't wait for an emergency event to make sure that this load transfer will implement. One thing you're going to do, I would assume, in a facility like this is you will do thorough testing during commissioning to make sure that load transfer works seamlessly. And again, also you will do ongoing regular testing, practicing, making sure this works. So this is a minimum that is required for maintenance. Also, make sure you proactively switch to engine generator power. There was a site that, possibly understandably, that waited to switch to engine generator power, although they knew the storm was coming. The reason they did that is they wanted to save their fuel. They wanted as much fuel duration as they could have. So they waited to switch until they actually lost utility, and that's just risky. You really want to proactively switch to engine generator. This way, when the storm hits, you know you're on engine generators and you won't lose power. So what needed improvement in terms of planning? Although planning worked very well, there are areas for improvement. And as I mentioned, you should make sure that your plans are up to date, contact information, roles, and responsibilities. There were some sites that said that they had cloud service providers. They were going to work with their cloud service providers to make sure that they also had plans in place. Also related to that they wanted to work with their cloud service providers to make sure that they had redundant topology if they deemed that was useful. There were some sites that said related to staff, they would bring staff on site earlier next time. And regardless of all of this, planning was still cited as the most frequently listed item as something that kept them up and running and successful. So I've got some anecdotes here. First one, there was a site that reported that they had power. That's because they had engine generators, and they were the only one in their area that was up and running. Now, the neighbors saw this, and they assumed, incorrectly, they assumed that this particular data center site had some special compensation from the utility, and they had utility up and running. So these neighbors actually contacted the utility, said they wanted to be turned back on also. There was another site that had a sufficient volume of fuel. However, their fuel was underwater, so they weren't able to run their generators. The quote, I thought this was very, very good. Couldn't get those gens to run very well on seawater. I think in retrospect, there was some humor. I'm sure there wasn't at the time. There was another quote here that says, our roofing system is only waterproof when water follows gravity. Now consider that the building shell is watertight. It's designed for a certain wind speed, wind direction. This is something to consider if you're building a new site. Do you want to go above and beyond the code? What is the best investment that you can make? Where should you put your money? And then this last one I thought was very creative. This was a site that knew that if they were going to lose power, their employees also were likely to lose power at their homes. So they actually provided engine generators for their staff at their homes. That way their staff would be less distracted and more available to come onto site and work. So in summary, these were the successes and these were the losses at a high level. So successes were due to planning, having good staff, qualified staff, and on-site fuel seemed to be very key. Also make sure that you're doing proper operations, you're testing your switchover, and you're actually pre-planning and doing the switchover ahead of time. Now, 2 losses were shown. One is critical components below grade. That can be avoided. Move a lot of your components above grade. And again, also depending on external resources for fuel. Now, bottom line, you're trying to keep your IT up and running. I'm not sure if everyone can see this slide. This is actually a trampoline and power lines. This was in Connecticut. You never know the impacts. So solutions, things to consider, review your site location, locate equipment again at higher elevation, make sure if it is the right thing for your business model to have a robust on-site infrastructure, have effective maintenance and operations, make sure you have a thorough disaster recovery plan in place, and make sure it's up to date, current. In closure, this is a quote from a respondent, and I think it reflects a lot of what we say here at the Uptime Institute. And this is a good infrastructure design, knowledgeable and well-trained staff, and a regimented maintenance program are all contributing factors to surviving an event of this magnitude. So any questions? And I don't know if there's a mic for questions, but sure, go ahead.
2 questions.
Sure.
One, how many users have you seen that actually plan on making substantial changes because of what they experienced? Or are they taking the attitude, well, it won't happen again for another 1,000 years?
The majority, well, the sites that said that they wouldn't do anything different because they were successful was good, but really a vast majority said that they were looking at upgrading their infrastructure. There were also sites that said they were looking at either consolidating sites or moving sites. That was already something that's always being discussed, and so they're looking at maybe accelerating some of that.
Chris, we're kind of out of time here, so what I would suggest is you continue that discussion. It's really important as we learn from Storm Sandy. There are 3 elements to this. How much preparation do you have? How long is the duration? And how long is the recovery? Out here in California, we get very little advance notice of an earthquake, and it might take years to recover. So you need to understand what the context is where your data center lives, and then emulate these best practices and recommendations that Debbie has shared with us. Thank you very much, Debbie.
Thank you.